Good morning. Our reading this morning is from John 20:19 to 31. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you, and as the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the marks of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Katie. Papers. Playing a disappearing game. The people of the high Andes that we had the privilege of serving don't speak the language of the country, which is Spanish. They speak the ancient Inca language of Quechua. And so I will say hello, Ayancho. And then would usually follow that with Nogankani Doug. My name is Doug. In August 8th of 2014, there was a posting on Facebook, and it's usually the sort of thing that I tend to ignore. It said, "Pass this along, and in 2 days, something amazing will happen." And I was skeptical, as I usually am of that sort of thing. But 2 days later happened to be my birthday, and so I went, okay, I will. And I passed it on. And on my birthday, I got a call from a fellow Rotarian, Mike Hamill, who said, "Would you be interested in being part of a medical outreach team to Peru?" And I went, "You're setting me up, right? This is a joke." And he went, "No, I'm serious." And the medical director, Dr. Kathleen Ross, would like to have a conversation with you about that. And so, with Rotary International, there's opportunities, there's monies that are gathered together in what's called the Rotary Foundation. And they had a new program. This was the first of its kind from our district, which extends from Hope in the Fraser Valley to White Rock in the west, along the north side of the Fraser River, but not including New Westminster and Burnaby, and down into the States as far south as Everett, Washington, or just beyond Everett. And so a global grant application was made to Rotary International for a vocational training team, which was the title of the group that we were working with. And we had the opportunity, well, I should say that Dr. Kathleen, when she said what she had in mind, her vision of need for a physio on this medical outreach team was to show people stretches, because they were for people with chronic back and joint issues because of the harsh conditions they live in and the very physical work they're required to do. Well, I recommended Katie because of her teaching background, but alas, she felt that I was her man. I said that I didn't see the value of just giving exercises without the patient's understanding of why. So the challenge was to develop a program script which could be translated into Spanish for the DSEA staff, and I'll explain about DSEA, to them to deliver to the villagers in their native Quechua language. This program was designed for people who are not literate, and I choose this term rather than illiterate, which to me implies the fact that they're not very bright, and that's anything but the truth. Therefore, the program needed to be an interactive instruction model accompanied by visuals. And the same Mike Hamill has an artistic talent and developed a series of stretches and exercises and lifting techniques with models. And he created the figures dressed in traditional clothing so that it would be more acceptable to the folks in the villages. It included basic musculoskeletal anatomy, that was my part of the thing, to demonstrate how joints move, body mechanics to show better ways to use the bony frame, and chances to try this in action. None of the classes could have been achieved without my translator and now friend, Urbano Hoyano. Urbano was my physio assistant in consulting with the patients which were referred to me in the clinics that we set up in the villages. Either sent by the doctors because they recognized physical problems that I could assess and give advice on, or by the intake desk, the DSEA nurses and Callies, and I'll explain that, when they came in to see us. DSEA, the magic of DSEA, it started just 10 years ago by Sandra McGurr, who is a nurse practitioner, and her husband, Sandy Hart, who, for want of a better term, is an environmental engineer. And he developed, DSEA developed a patient and gentle relationship with the remote villages in the high Andes. With the offer of clean water via the modified biosand filter system that Sandy had developed from a traditional model, which is layers of rock and sand through which water is poured, and because of the bacteria in the rock and sand, it eats the microbes and the nasty bugs that create issues in anyone's gut over the years. And to try and improve a situation for anyone, whether it's health or general well-being, without starting with clean water, it's really not a successful exercise. And Sandra developed a health education and support system with her team of Quechua-speaking practical nurses. I believe the key to the success is the development, their development of an elected health advocate in each village. And the Quechua word for health, the short term is Cali, And so each of these villages elected a Cali to serve as their, if you will, triage nurse, their first line of health resource, because there's no hospitals. In fact, the villages are really just a collection of buildings where now there's schooling for the kids. So they're becoming literate, but no infrastructure in terms of government services or whatnot. Usually a community hall where people gather together. So this was 2016 that a team of 11 of us went to the high Andes, and that included some firemen paramedics who in the middle of the 3-week period did an intensive advanced first aid training program. And again, because these folks are not literate, what we had to do was develop a series of scenarios of accidents and whatnot, which included, ironically, a bus accident, where dozens of us, those of us who were in the team, were made up to look like we had been injured with compound fractures, head injuries, burns, and the Calis, as a team, had to assess the victims and then move on when they realized that one was dead, and you check a vital again the second time to ensure, and then you move on, because you have to develop and put your treatment where it's going to be most effective. So this was our team in 2017, last Easter at this time. Katie and I on both sides, Sandra McGurr, the nurse practitioner, and Sandy and Sandra are both from Tapla Lake here in British Columbia. The center person is Dr. Kathleen Ross, the medical director, and her associate in New Westminster at the hospital, Sharon Sundvid, sorry. And next to Katie, in between Sharon, is my friend Urbano, a wonderful young man. We can move on. We arrived after 48 hours because our plane was diverted and we couldn't make our connection to Lima, and so it was 48 hours instead of 24 to get to Cusco. And this is just an image at one of the Inca ruins above the city of Cusco, which 25 years ago when, or 26 now, when Sylvie and Brian Janssens were honeymooning there, the population was about 50,000. Well, it's now over 500,000 people that live in that bowl. Moving on. This just shows some of the follow-up of the first aid that occurred just before we went in January of 2017. And again, the Calis were then taking the opportunity to teach what they had learned the year before to fellow villagers. Wound management practice, and we can move on with the slide. Registering patients and assessing patients as they came in, taking their vital signs and blood pressure. That's what happened at each of the clinics that we went established in the 6 different villages that we visited. And Shirley was mentioning earlier today she's had a miraculous recovery of her hearing after having her ear washed out. And this shows an example of the Cali doing just that for one of the elderly folks in her village. And explaining the medications and the treatments to the staff, through the staff to the Calis, so that they could follow up with effective care. Moving on. Physio was part of what we were doing and doing assessments of individuals, but also teaching the group the script, if you will, that we had developed about how to lift things. And one of the examples of that is found a big rock, and there's replete with rocks at 15,000 feet, I have to tell you. So had a big rock and brought a person forward and asked him to hold the rock out here, and left him for a while. You could see that it was starting to strain on him. And I said, now bring it in closer. Is it easier? Yes. And other examples like that to show how body mechanics, how you do things, make a difference into the stress and the strains you put on your bony frame. And so, moving on was just an example, and putting these learnings into action. One of the stories that we heard after the fact was of a Callie in her village. There were men putting new corrugated metal roofing on the public building, which housed our clinic when we were there. Well, a gust of wind took that piece of metal and threw it through the air and into a man's leg, lacerating the main nerve in that leg, the femoral artery. Immediately the men, and this is a society that is a male-dominated society, and the first thing they did after 8 years of experience with the Callies being the go-to person in their village for emergency health, they called Evarista. And Evarista came and realized that the man was bleeding out and was shocky, dealt with having the blood vessel tourniqueted to stop the bleeding, apply a pressure bandage, and sent the cell phone, which DeSaya provides to them, as well as a salary, a kilometer and a half away to a high point where there would be cell reception, to call for air ambulance, because she recognized that this man needed to be air ambulanced out in order to have any hope of saving his life. Well, it worked. The man was flown up to Cusco, and the surgeon who saved the man's life happened to have been a Quechua-speaking individual from birth, and called Evarista to say, "You saved this man's life." Simply acting on the knowledge that she had gained from what we had been able to share with them. And an interesting fact, on the return visit of the firemen paramedics and the refresher course that the Callies taught, they of course didn't have a manual to refer to, but people with an oral tradition have amazing memories and used what they had learned and applied into action to save this man's life. 2 weeks ago, Evarista again served her community as a hero. What were the details, Katie?
That was a fracture.
A woman had fallen working in the field, and these fields are at, extreme angles, and had injured her leg. Well, the next day, one of the villagers said, "Evarista, you need to go see this woman." She did, and recognized that this lady had a fracture of her leg. And the people were trying to move her and she said, "No, what we have to do is stabilize this first." And so she used this critical situation as a teaching moment for all of the people in the village. She showed them how to properly splint, and then use the stretcher that DeSaya had provided, actually courtesy of our first visit there. We brought 35 boxes and crates of materials, including resuscitation dolls to show that sort of intervention, and infant resuscitation. And they had to then carry this person 5 kilometers to a place where a taxi come ambulance could take her for medical attention. But again, without the intervention and knowledge that Evarista had learned, and the reputation and regard that the community has developed for these Kellys, this woman may well have suffered injury that would have left her permanently crippled. The Peruvian Health Ministry is now seeking input. We can move on. This actually is a picture of Evarista on the right, and on the upper left it says Celia, but I know, having met her twice, that that's Evarista. But you see the colorful clothing, and they weave most of what they wear, except for their sweater sets, which look like something out of the 50s or 60s, the synthetic sweaters and whatnot. And when we met them, they were often inside out, and we thought, and we wondered, why is it? Well, because probably the other side wasn't as clean, so they wanted to present to us their best face forward. The Peruvian ministry is actually using the teaching that Nisea has had in these villages, and is having their healthcare workers do trainings with the Kellys and with the Nisea nurses. They're recognizing the effect that they've had. And I noticed a significant change in my return. We can move on with the slides. This talks about the message of sustainability, and part of what is important is that knowing the community, encouraging the local people to be involved and accept ownership of this, to provide the training, which they did, to use local people, the Kellys and their resources, and that includes traditional herbs and applications of poultices and that sort of thing, not denying what they've been using for hundreds of years, but accepting that and encouraging that in combination with an increased knowledge of best health practices in their reality, and working to identify funding sources and to measure the effect of what they're doing in meaningful ways. This was a typical campaign poster which would have been up in the villages, because the village, as I said, is just a collection of public buildings and would serve houses because these are farmers, subsistence farmers. At 14,000 feet, hardly anything grows except potatoes. In Peru, there are hundreds of varieties of potatoes. And they do have animals, llamas, or as you would hear there, llamas. And we're llama.